really had a chance, I thought, to look at my life and try to overcome some of my baggage.
Shirley MacLaine's daughter is finally speaking out, and she's not holding back. After years of silence, Sachi Parker is revealing the painful truth about what it was really like growing up with one of Hollywood's most beloved stars. Her words are sharp, her pain is palpable, and she famously calls her mother the worst. So, what really happened behind the scenes of all that fame and glamour? And why is this story only now coming to light? Join us as we uncover the emotional scars, shocking secrets, and a lifelong silence that tore this mother-daughter relationship apart. Shirley MacLaine's early years were anything but soft or gentle. Born in 1934 in Richmond, Virginia, she was raised in a highly strict and unyielding home. Her childhood wasn't filled with the usual memories many kids hold dear: afternoons of imaginative play, bedtime stories, or warm hugs from a parent. Instead, her life was meticulously scheduled, relentlessly focused, and filled with towering expectations that began the moment she could walk. Her mother was a woman of fierce will and ambition. She had once dreamed of a grand life in the performing arts, but those dreams never came to fruition. That unfulfilled desire didn't fade. It was simply passed down. Shirley wasn't just a daughter to her. She was a second chance. Her mother pushed Shirley to reach the kind of greatness she had once envisioned for herself. This wasn't gentle encouragement. It was pressure, sometimes heavy and relentless. Shirley had to be excellent. There was no space for mediocrity. Her father, on the other hand, was a respected school principal. He held strict values and believed in hard work above all else. He taught Shirley that success was never given. It had to be earned. There were no shortcuts and no excuses. The idea that effort equals worth was hammered into her from the very beginning. While he wasn't cruel, he wasn't openly affectionate either. In his world, discipline was the road to achievement, and achievement was the ultimate destination. Together, her parents created an environment where softness had no place. Shirley grew up surrounded by rules and expectations. There was a clear message in that household: do better, be better, always improve. And if you weren't striving for more, you were falling behind as a child. Shirley's time wasn't spent like most other kids. There were no playdates at the park or lazy weekends. Instead, there were endless ballet rehearsals. Every movement had to be flawless. Every step had to be precise. Her days were filled with practice and performance. Making mistakes wasn't just seen as a small issue. It was treated as a failure. Shirley learned very young that success was her only viable option, and in this environment, love wasn't something that came naturally or freely. It wasn't spoken often or shown through affection. For Shirley, love seemed to arrive only when she accomplished something. It came in moments of praise after a performance or a good report card, not during hard days or moments of self-doubt. This taught her something that would shape her entire life. Love had to be earned. You had to prove yourself to be worthy of it. This belief didn't just stay in her childhood. It followed her into adulthood. From a young age, Shirley developed a deep hunger to be more, to prove her worth, and to be seen. That need pushed her into the spotlight later in life. But it all began in her living room, in front of her parents, desperately trying to be good enough for their approval. And as you'll see next, chasing a dream doesn't always leave room for being a present parent. After spending her entire childhood under the strict discipline of her Virginia home, Shirley MacLaine was ready for something different. Her early life had been defined by hard work, endless ballet training, and the constant pressure to be perfect. But deep down, Shirley wanted more than just her parents' approval. She wanted freedom. She wanted to be seen on her own terms. As soon as she could, she packed her bags and left her hometown behind. Her destination was New York City. To many, New York is the place where dreams are forged. For Shirley, it represented possibility. She was determined to make it on Broadway. That was the goal. She imagined bright lights, roaring applause, and standing ovations. But when she got there, the reality hit hard. The city wasn't warm or welcoming. It was loud, crowded, competitive, and unforgiving. Shirley arrived with ambition, but very little money. She had to take whatever job she could find just to get by. She worked as a model, a secretary, and at times, even a dance teacher, anything to pay the rent. There were days she didn't know if she would eat. She lived in cheap apartments and often worried about how she would make it through the week. Every audition meant waiting in long lines, facing rejection after rejection, and still waking up the next day to try again. But giving up wasn't an option. Shirley had been raised to endure, to keep pushing no matter how hard things got. That mindset kept her going. She refused to fail. She knew there was no backup plan. Broadway wasn't just a dream, it was the only way forward. Then came the moment. That changed everything. Shirley was working as an understudy in a Broadway production. That meant she wasn't the star or even the regular performer, she was the backup. But one night, the lead dancer couldn't perform. Suddenly, without any time to prepare, Shirley was called to step in. It was the kind of chance that could make or break a career. When she walked on stage, everything clicked. The lights, the music, the energy of the crowd. This was where she belonged. Her performance was strong, confident, and full of raw energy. That night, she didn't just fill in. She stood out, and people noticed. Hollywood came calling soon after. Talent scouts and producers had seen her performance and wanted more. Shirley went from being a backup on a Broadway stage to being offered roles in major films. It was a swift transition, but she didn't hesitate. This was everything she had worked for. As her film career took off, Shirley quickly became one of the most talked about young actresses in the business. She had a unique presence, and her past as a trained dancer gave her an edge. She brought something fresh to the screen. Offers kept coming, and with each role, her fame grew. But as her career soared, her personal life became less of a priority. There was no time for family dinners, friendships, or building a stable home life. Everything now revolved around scripts, studio schedules, and constant travel. She didn't slow down to build roots. She was too busy chasing the next opportunity. And as the spotlight grew brighter, one part of her life, being a mother, began to slip completely out of focus. By the late 1950s, Shirley MacLaine had become one of the brightest stars in Hollywood. After her big break on Broadway, she quickly moved into film, and audiences couldn't get enough of her. Directors were impressed by her natural talent, and she brought something fresh and exciting to every role. She had a charm that felt authentic, a bold confidence that stood out, and a look that was both classic and modern at the same time. Hollywood fully embraced her. She wasn't just another pretty face, she had depth. Shirley could make people laugh in one film and cry in the next. She played unforgettable roles in movies like The Apartment, where she starred alongside Jack Lemmon, and Sweet Charity, a musical that showcased her dancing skills and emotional range. These weren't just good performances, they were powerful. And they made her a household name. She was admired not only for her talent, but also for her ability to take on a wide variety of roles. Whether it was comedy, drama, romance, or musicals, Shirley could do it all. Her energy, honesty, and wit made her stand out in a time when many actresses were expected to fit a certain mold. She broke that mold. She didn't play it safe, and people respected her for it. But behind all the fame and excitement, her personal life told a very different story. On paper, Shirley was married to businessman Steve Parker. To the public, they seemed like a strong couple. She was a famous actress, and he was a respected man with global business interests, particularly in Japan. Their marriage lasted 4 decades, which was rare in Hollywood, and many people assumed they had found a way to make it work. But the truth was much more complicated. Shirley and Steve didn't live like a typical married couple. They were almost always apart. She lived in Los Angeles, constantly working on movie sets, traveling for premieres, or filming in different parts of the world. Steve, meanwhile, lived in Japan and spent most of his time there. Their lives were completely separate. They had An agreement whether spoken or just understood that allowed them both to live the way they wanted without interference. They didn't share a home, and they didn't share much of a day-to-day life. They had what looked like a marriage, but it wasn't based on closeness or connection. It was distant and quite more of a partnership than a love story. They avoided asking each other hard questions. They didn't challenge each other or get in one another's way. For some, this might have seemed like freedom, but for Shirley, it also meant emotional distance. As Shirley's fame continued to grow, she stayed focused on her career. She didn't pause to question what was missing in her personal life. The success was real, but so was the emptiness that started to follow her. And while she was building an unforgettable career in front of the cameras, someone very important was slowly disappearing behind the scenes. As Shirley MacLaine's fame grew, so did her interest in something far beyond the film industry. While many celebrities focused on fame, wealth, or power, Shirley turned her attention toward the spiritual world. She became deeply involved in the study of reincarnation, cosmic energy, and metaphysics. This wasn't just a passing interest. It became a major part of her life, shaping how she saw the world and herself. Shirley began to believe that she had lived many past lives. She spoke openly about being a Mongolian warrior in one lifetime and a priestess in another. She believed her soul had traveled through centuries, moving from one form to another, always learning and evolving. These ideas became more than just beliefs. They became her truth. She felt she was connected to something much bigger than the material world, and she wanted others to understand this connection too. Books, interviews, and public talks helped her spread her ideas. She became known as much for her spiritual views as she was for her acting. She claimed to have memories of ancient times, deep soul connections with people she met, and a constant awareness of higher energy. Her spirituality gave her meaning and identity. But while Shirley was exploring the universe, something much closer to home was being neglected. Her own daughter, Sachi Parker, was the only child of Shirley MacLaine and Steve Parker. Unlike her mother, Sachi didn't need answers about past lives or the cosmos. She needed something simple and human, her mother's presence. She needed love, support, and attention. But she didn't get those things, as Shirley's focus turned more toward spiritual growth and less toward parenting. Sachi was left to grow up in emotional isolation. Shirley was often absent physically, traveling for work or her spiritual interests. But even when she was around, her emotional presence was minimal. According to Sachi, affection in their home was rare. Hugs, comforting words, and bonding moments were almost non-existent. When Sachi was still young, Shirley made the decision to send her away to live with her father in Japan. The official explanation was that Sachi would benefit from cultural exposure, a new environment, and independence. But behind that story, the real reason may have been something else, something harder to face. Sending Sachi away may have simply made Shirley's life easier. With her daughter in Japan, Shirley could continue traveling, working, and focusing on her spiritual journey without the responsibilities of motherhood getting in the way. This decision had long-lasting effects. Sachi didn't just feel physically far from her mother. She felt emotionally abandoned. She was thousands of miles away, watching from a distance as her mother walked red carpets, appeared on magazine covers, and spoke about spiritual enlightenment. But none of that filled the emptiness Sachi felt. She wasn't asking for cosmic truths. She was asking to be seen, to be loved, to matter. While Shirley was speaking about soul journeys and reincarnation, her daughter was trying to figure out how to cope with a mother who felt like a stranger. Shirley may have believed she was expanding her awareness and reaching new levels of consciousness. But at the same time, she was losing touch with the one person who needed her most. And as Sachi grew older, the distance between them didn't shrink. It only got wider. While Shirley MacLaine was becoming one of Hollywood's most loved and celebrated stars, her daughter, Sachi Parker, was living a completely different life, far away from flashing cameras, designer gowns, and standing ovations. Sachi didn't grow up in Beverly Hills or on glamorous film sets. She spent much of her childhood in Japan, living with her father, Steve Parker. while her mother stayed in Hollywood. From a very young age, Sachi was watching her mother's life from a distance, both physically and emotionally. Across the ocean, Sachi would see magazine covers featuring her mother, interviews full of laughter and charm, and red carpet appearances that painted Shirley as warm, funny, and full of life. To the public, Shirley MacLaine was magnetic, someone who lit up every room she entered. But to Sachi, the version of her mother that the world saw didn't match the person she knew. Sachi's childhood lacked the basics of emotional connection. There were no bedtime stories, no gentle goodnight kisses, and no one tucking her in or checking on her after a bad dream. There were no regular phone calls or visits to make her feel loved or supported. When Shirley did call or write, it was often brief and impersonal. There was no real effort to bond or ask about Sachi's feelings. Instead, she felt more like an afterthought, someone her mother remembered. Only when it was convenient, the love Sachi needed wasn't big or complicated. She didn't want anything more than what most children expect from a parent: attention, care, and a sense of belonging. But instead of warmth, she grew up with silence. Instead of being embraced, she was left alone. The world may have adored Shirley MacLaine, but her daughter grew up feeling invisible. One of the most painful parts of Sachi's story was the emotional abandonment she experienced. It wasn't just about being physically apart. It was about not being seen or valued for who she was. She didn't feel special to her mother. She didn't feel like she came first. There was no bond built between them, no shared experiences that brought them closer over time. To the public, Shirley was full of personality, funny, outspoken, and deeply philosophical. But in private, with her daughter, she was distant and cold. Sachi rarely saw the kind of motherly behavior others assumed Shirley had. There were no heart-to-heart conversations or moments of affection. Her mother, who could entertain millions with her charm, couldn't offer the same warmth to her own child. This disconnect created deep emotional wounds. Sachi began to feel that love in her mother's world was something you had to earn. It wasn't freely given. It was transactional, given when you performed well, stayed quiet, or fit the image expected of you. Shirley had spent her life believing that success brought value. That belief had been passed down to her daughter in a painful way. For Sachi, this meant constantly feeling like she wasn't enough. If she didn't meet certain standards, if she wasn't impressive or successful in her own right, then she didn't feel worthy of love. It wasn't about being loved for who she was. It was about proving she deserved to be loved at all. That pressure shaped much of her early life, leaving her with lasting questions about her worth and her place in the world. And as she grew older, the silence between them didn't fade. It only became louder. On the surface, Shirley MacLaine and Steve Parker seemed to have one of the rare, long-lasting marriages in Hollywood. They were married for nearly 3 decades, and for many years, the public saw them as a strong and stable couple. But behind closed doors, their relationship looked very different. It wasn't built on a deep emotional connection or shared commitment. Instead, it was an arrangement that quietly allowed them to live completely separate lives. Shirley stayed in Hollywood, focused on her acting career and spiritual exploration. Steve lived in Japan, handling his own business interests and creating a life of his own. They spent long stretches of time apart, sometimes months or even years, with little involvement in each other's daily lives. It was widely believed and later confirmed that both had affairs during their marriage. There were rumors about Shirley's romances with other men, and Steve was said to have had several relationships of his own in Japan. Theirs was essentially an open marriage, though it was never publicly labeled that way during their time together. It was convenient. They didn't question each other's choices, didn't interfere with one another's freedom, and didn't demand traditional roles. There were no expectations for emotional closeness or even physical presence. It was a silent agreement that worked for them, but it came at a cost, especially for their daughter Sachi, in this distant and separate lifestyle. Sachi was the one who ended up forgotten. She wasn't the focus for either parent. Shirley was, often away filming or involved in spiritual pursuits. Steve was overseas running his business and living his own life. No one was consistently there for Sachi. She was caught in the space between two parents who weren't really present, and she had to grow up mostly on her own. There was no real structure, no strong support system, and no consistent emotional guidance. Sachi didn't grow up in a home where love, stability, and family life were nurtured. Instead, she lived in the cracks of a relationship that functioned only on the surface. She was a child in a family that existed more as an image than a reality. In the end, what looked like a functioning family was really just an illusion. As Sachi Parker grew older, the pain of her childhood didn't fade. It followed her, years of feeling ignored, unloved, and forgotten by her parents. Especially her mother left deep emotional wounds. She had spent her life wondering why. She never felt wanted, why she was pushed aside, and why no one ever put her first thought. Eventually, Sachi reached a breaking point. The questions she had carried in silence for so long could no longer be buried. She needed answers from the one person who had hurt her the most, her mother. The confrontation was not sudden. It was the result of years of pain, confusion, and emotional distance. Sachi decided to speak to Shirley face to face. She wasn't looking for a fight. She was looking for truth. She needed to ask the questions that had haunted her since she was a child. Was she a burden? An accident? Why was she sent away? Why was there never any warmth, never any comfort or affection? These questions weren't easy to ask. They carried all the weight of a lifetime spent trying to make sense of a relationship that had never felt real. Sachi hoped that speaking openly might lead to healing or at least understanding. What she got, however, was far from that. Shirley's response was cold, not angry, not emotional, just distant and dismissive. Instead of listening with compassion, she brushed off the questions. She avoided responsibility, redirected the conversation, and made no effort to understand where Sachi was coming from. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the emotional damage that had been done, no moment of reflection. It was as if Sachi's pain didn't matter. Was this response rooted in guilt, in denial, or was it simply indifference? Sachi couldn't tell for sure, but what hurt most was that Shirley showed no sign that she truly cared. There was no emotional connection, no attempt to bridge the gap between them. Sachi had finally found the courage to open her heart, but her mother didn't meet her halfway. Instead, she closed the door even more tightly. In that moment, everything became clear for Sachi. The feeling she had carried for so long that her mother had never really seen her was now confirmed. Shirley hadn't seen her, not as a daughter, not as a person with feelings and needs. She had only seen herself, her goals, her freedom, and her spiritual path. Everything else, even motherhood, had come second. She had a story to tell, and soon, the world would hear it. In 2013, Sachi Parker made a decision that would change everything. She wrote a memoir titled Lucky Me, My Life with and Without My Mother, Shirley MacLaine. It was the first time she publicly shared the truth about her childhood, her strained relationship with her famous mother, and the emotional damage she had carried in silence for decades. The book was raw, painful, and brutally honest. It pulled back the curtain on the glamorous image the world had of Shirley MacLaine and revealed something much more complicated and heartbreaking. Sachi had kept quiet for years out of loyalty, fear, and the hope that things might one day improve. But they never did. The distance between her and her mother never closed. The questions were never answered, and the emotional wounds never healed. Writing the memoir became a way for her to finally tell her side of the story that had always been overshadowed by her mother's fame and carefully crafted public image. In Lucky Me, Sachi described growing up without the kind of love and support that every child needs. She shared stories of being sent away at a young age to live with her father in Japan, with little explanation and no emotional preparation. She spoke about the years spent hoping for a visit, a phone call, or even a letter that rarely came. Her mother's physical absence was constant, but what hurt even more was her emotional absence. Even when they were in the same room, Shirley never offered warmth, connection, or affection. Sachi also revealed how deeply confused she had been about her family. One of the most shocking claims in the book was about a story Shirley had told her for years. According to Sachi, Shirley insisted that Steve Parker, Sachi's father, had stolen all of Sachi's trust fund money. For a long time, Sachi believed her. It made sense, given that her father was distant and had been portrayed as cold and careless. But later, Sachi discovered that this story may not have been true at all. The accusation was never backed by real evidence. Eventually, she came to believe that her father may have been wrongly blamed. If that was the case, then the person she had spent years resenting may not have been at fault. And the one who told her the story, her own mother, may have either misunderstood the truth or knowingly twisted it. Whether it was manipulation or just a tragic misunderstanding, it had a lasting impact. That story poisoned Sachi's view of her father and shaped her sense of trust and identity. She felt betrayed not just by the lie itself, but by the idea that her mother could have used it to control or distance her from the truth. And even after telling the world her truth, the mother-daughter divide remained as wide as ever. After the release of Lucky Me, My Life with and Without My Mother, Shirley MacLaine, the world waited to hear how Shirley MacLaine would respond to her daughter's deeply personal and painful memoir. Sachi Parker had laid out decades of emotional hurt and abandonment, sharing details that shocked many fans of the beloved actress. But Shirley's reaction was not one of apology or reconciliation. Instead, she publicly dismissed her daughter's claims. Shirley called the memoir overblown and distorted. In interviews, she described Sachi's version of events as exaggerated and misleading. She denied many of the painful experiences Sachi had written about. Rather than taking time to reflect or consider her daughter's emotional reality, Shirley seemed to brush it all aside. To her, the book didn't deserve serious attention. She saw it as something hurtful and unfair, not something that required a heartfelt response. This reaction made it clear there would be no reunion, no honest conversation, and no acknowledgement of the past. Shirley did not express regret. She did not apologize for the years of distance or the emotional neglect her daughter described. Instead, she focused on defending her image and protecting the narrative she had built over decades. Whether out of pride, denial, or emotional self-protection, she showed no signs of opening the door to real understanding. For Shirley, admitting fault may have felt like tearing apart everything she stood for. Her public identity had always been one of strength, independence, and personal freedom. She had carved a path for herself as a woman who didn't follow traditional rules, someone who lived life on her own terms without apology. To acknowledge the harm she may have caused her daughter would have meant confronting a lifetime of emotional avoidance. It would have meant admitting that despite all her accomplishments, she had failed in one of the most personal roles of all, being a mother. The emotional gap between Shirley and Sachi had existed for years. But after the book's release and Shirley's cold response, the divide became permanent. Any hope that Sachi may have had for healing or reconnection seemed to vanish. Their relationship, once distant and strained, was now completely broken. In the end, the damage was too deep to fix. The story of Shirley and Sachi became a story not just about fame or family, but about the lasting impact of emotional absence. It showed how silence can shape a life just as much as words, and how some wounds, once exposed, are never truly healed. If you found this story moving or thought-provoking, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next deep dive. Thanks for watching.